Chapter 1. The Beginnings of the French Monarchy, from the Merovingians to the Carolingians. If you want to tell the story of the French monarchy, you have to go back a long way, even before there was such a thing as France. The term monarchy literally means autocracy, and in the case of France, it is an institution that existed in very different forms for more than 1,000 years. From the first Germanic kings of the Merovingians to the Carolingian dynasty to the Bourbons, from the Middle Ages to the French Revolution and beyond, the monarchy shaped France's identity like few others. The roots lie in the 5th century AD, in a time of upheaval. The Roman Empire, which had ruled Western Europe for centuries, had collapsed. In Gaul, the area of today's France, Roman descendants, Celtic peoples, and Germanic tribes lived. Among them, the Franks, a tribal group that had settled in the northeast, stood out. The first big name in this story is Clovis I, the founder of the Merovingian dynasty. Clovis, who became king of the Franks around 481, managed to unite the fragmented tribes under his rule. His decisive step, however, was his baptism into Christianity in 496. With this act, he sided with the Roman Catholic Church and won its support. This covenant between throne and altar was to shape the French monarchy for centuries. The king was not only considered a secular ruler, but also a guardian of the faith appointed by God. Under the Merovingians, the Frankish Empire grew considerably. But the dynasty had a problem. The succession was often divided among the sons, which splintered the empire into rival parts. Soon, the kings lost power, while the Hausmayer, i.e. the administrators of the royal court, became more and more influential. From this development emerged the next dynasty, the Carolingians. Charles Martel, Hausmayer in the 8th century, became famous because he stopped the Arab expansion to the west at Tours and Poitiers in 732. His son, Pippin the Younger, finally took the decisive step. He deposed the last Merovingian king and had himself anointed king in 751, with papal approval. This was the beginning of Carolingian rule. The greatest among the Carolingians was undoubtedly Charlemagne. As king of the Franks from 768, and later as emperor, crowned by the Pope in 800, he created an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Europe. He is considered the father of Europe because he tried to bundle the Western world into a political unity. Under Charles, the monarchy was also ideologically refounded. The king was not only a ruler by inheritance, but also confirmed by divine mandate. With the Carolingians, the monarchy took on an almost sacred character. The coronation was not simply a political ceremony, but a sacred act in which the king was anointed with holy oil. This tradition of anointing in Reims was to remain central to the French kings until the Revolution. But the Carolingian Empire soon disintegrated again. After Charles' death in 814, his sons and grandsons divided the empire among themselves. From this inheritance, what was later called France slowly emerged, the West Franconian Empire. An independent monarchy was created here, which developed over the centuries and finally became the crown of France. Thus, the Merovingians and Carolingians stand at the beginning of the French monarchy. They laid the foundations, the connection between king and church, the idea of the king as an anointed ruler, dynastic legitimacy, and the pursuit of a united empire. These elements were to accompany France's monarchy until its end, albeit in ever new forms. In the next chapter, we will see how the Carolingian legacy evolved into the Capetian dynasty, which stabilized and shaped France's royalty for centuries. Chapter 2. The Capetians, Building a Stable Dynasty. After the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century, the Western Frankish Empire, later France, was strongly fragmented. Powerful dukes, counts, and feudal lords determined political life, while royal authority was weak. Although the king was formally supreme, his actual power often extended little beyond his own crown land, which was essentially limited to Île-de-France. In this unstable environment, the Capetians succeeded in founding a dynasty that was to shape France for centuries. The first king from this family was Hugh Capet, who was elected in 987. He was not a powerful monarch in the modern sense, but rather one among many princes. But his name became a symbol because from him onwards, an almost uninterrupted succession continued, giving the monarchy of France a hitherto unknown stability. While other kingdoms were often shaken by succession disputes or dynasty changes, the Capetians ruled in a direct line for 3 centuries. What was special about the early Capetians was their ability to secure the crown as a family property. Even during their lifetime, they had their sons crowned co-kings so that a seamless transition was guaranteed. This allowed the idea that the crown was not electable but hereditary, a decisive step towards consolidating the monarchy. Nevertheless, the power of the early Capetians was initially limited. The king was primus inter pares, the first among equals, and many vassals were richer and more powerful than he. But over the centuries, the Capetians succeeded in expanding their influence. This happened in various ways, through clever marriage policies, through the exploitation of successions, through conquests, and through the constant strengthening of the royal administrative apparatus. A milestone was the reign of Philip II, August, 1180 to 1223. He was the first Capetian to make France's power visible at the European level. Philip II defeated an alliance of English king, German emperor, and Flemish prince in the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. This victory enormously strengthened the prestige of the French crown and marked a turning point. France became a central power in Europe, and the king gained authority over his vassals. The Capetians also made progress at the institutional level. They created offices that administered the empire centrally, appointed officials, and thus created an antithesis to the local princes. The monarchy was increasingly supported not only by personal power, but also by structures. Another decisive factor was the symbolic power of the coronation in Reims. Here, the king was anointed with the holy oil from the ampulla of Reims, a ritual that emphasized the divine legitimacy of the ruler. This religious dimension distinguished the king from all other princes. While a duke or count ruled only by worldly power, the king was an anointed one of God. The unity of crown and empire also became particularly important. In the 13th century, the idea arose that the Kingdom of France was an indivisible heritage. Unlike in the early centuries when the empire was divided among the sons, the crown was now understood as indivisible. It could only be worn by a single heir. This rule enormously strengthened the stability of the empire and protected it from fragmentation. Under Louis IX, known as Saint Louis, 1226 to 1270, the Capetian monarchy reached a new height. Louis was not only a pious ruler, but also a skillful administrator. He promoted justice, appointed royal judges, and made Paris a center of culture and religion. His canonization process after his death gave the French monarchy an almost mythical dimension. The king could be not only a secular ruler, but also a holy ruler. In this way, the Capetians laid the foundations for what made France a great power in the Middle Ages. They transformed the monarchy from a weak institution into a stable dynasty with religious legitimacy, clear succession, and growing influence. In the next chapter, we will see how this development continued in the late Middle Ages, with the challenges of the 100 Years' War, the rivalry with England, and the question of whether the French monarchy could survive in times of crisis. Chapter 3: The 100 Years' War, Crisis and Renewal of the Monarchy. The 14th century was a time of the most serious crises for the French monarchy. At first glance, the Capetians' kingship seemed to be consolidated and powerful in the High Middle Ages, but tensions lurked beneath the surface. These erupted in the 100 Years' War, a conflict that not only decided the supremacy of Western Europe, but also profoundly changed the nature of the French monarchy. The trigger was the complicated succession. In 1328, Charles IV, the last direct Capetian, died without a male heir. According to Salian law, which regulated the succession to the throne, a woman was not allowed to inherit the throne, nor could she pass this claim on to her son. This rejected the claim of Edward III of England, who was a grandson of Philip IV through his mother Isabel of France. Instead, Philip VI was chosen from the Valois sidelines. Edward III did not accept this and laid claim to the French throne. The conflict between the houses of Valois and Plantagenet led to a war that would last over a century. The war began in 1337 and proceeded in several phases. At first, the English had surprising successes. Thanks to their superior tactics with longbowmen, they won legendary battles such as Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers. In Poitiers, even the French king John II was taken prisoner. These defeats deeply shook the reputation of the monarchy. In addition, there was the catastrophe of the plague, which swept across Europe from 1347 onwards and claimed millions of lives. France was depopulated, agriculture collapsed, and uprisings such as that of the Jacquerie shook the country. During this time, the monarchy appeared weak and incapable of acting. It was not until the late 14th century that the situation began to stabilize. Charles V, known as the Wise, R. 1364 to 1380, knew how to reform the administration and consolidate the empire. Under his rule, France slowly recovered, and royal authority regained weight. But already under his son, Charles VI, the crisis broke out again. Charles VI suffered from severe mental illnesses, which repeatedly made him incapable of governing. This led to internal power struggles between rival noble groups, the Bourguignons and the Armagnacs. In this chaotic situation, the English under Henry V achieved a new triumph. In the Battle of Azincourt in 1415, they destroyed the French army. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 was the low point for the French monarchy. It stipulated that Henry V and his descendants should inherit the French crown. France's independence seemed to be lost. But the story took an unexpected turn. In this darkest hour, Joan of Arc stepped onto the stage. The simple peasant girl from Domremy claimed to have divine visions that called her to work for the rightful king, Charles VII. In 1429, she led the French troops to the relief battle of Orléans, a victory that revived faith in the monarchy. A little later, Charles VII was crowned in Reims, and Joan of Arc had achieved her goal. The king's divine legitimacy was renewed. Although John was captured by the English in Rouen in 1431 and burned as a heretic, her commitment acted as a beacon. She later became the national saint and symbolic figure of the French monarchy. It marked the beginning of the turning point in the Hundred Years' War. Charles VII continued the reforms. He created a standing army and a centralized tax administration, which greatly strengthened the power of the monarchy. In this way, France was fundamentally different from England, where Parliament played a much greater role. In France, the crisis gave rise to a monarchy that was stronger and more independent than before. In 1453, the Hundred Years' War ended with the victory of the French in the Battle of Castellon. The English lost almost all of their possessions in France, with the exception of Calais. France was devastated, but politically united. The monarchy had survived the most serious crisis in its history and emerged stronger from it. The Hundred Years' War was more than a military conflict. It was a touchstone for the legitimacy of the French monarchy. It showed that the crown was not only worn by dynasty, but also by divine destiny. Joan of Arc embodied this in a unique way. At the same time, the war led to central reforms that made royalty more powerful than ever before. In the next chapter, we will see how the French monarchy grew to absolute rule in the early modern period, a process that began under the Valois and eventually reached its peak under the Bourbons. Chapter 4: The Valois and the Emergence of Absolutism. With the end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453, the French monarchy entered a new era. France was devastated, but the crown had gained the upper hand. Under Charles VII, and especially under his son Louis XI, the monarchy began to systematically expand its power. From the ruins of the Long Wars arose a kingdom that was led step by step on the path to absolutism, a form of rule in which the king had almost unlimited power. The Valois dynasty, which had been on the throne since 1328, was at the center of this development. Among them, France experienced a phase of consolidation, but also one of the greatest internal crises, the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. It was during these centuries that the French monarchy was formed, which would later shine in full splendor under the Bourbons in the 17th century. Louis XI, who reigned from 1461 to 1483, is often referred to as the Cobweb King. The nickname comes from his political sophistication. He weaved a web of alliances, intrigues, and administrative reforms with which he weakened the power of the feudal lords and strengthened the authority of the crown. Under Ludwig, a central administration began to develop, which steered the country more efficiently than ever before. He appointed officials who were directly subordinate to him, thus building the foundation of a monarchy that was no longer dependent on the favor of the great princes. Under the following Valois kings, Charles VIII and Louis XII, France began to expand its power outwards. The Italian Wars, 1494 to 1559, took the French kings deep into southern Italy. Although they were often costly militarily, they opened up France culturally to the Renaissance. With artists, scholars, and architects from Italy, a new spirit moved into the French courts. The real heyday of the Valois monarchy came under Francis I, 1515 to 1547. He is considered the Renaissance King of France. Francis was a patron of art and science. He brought Leonardo da Vinci to his court and had magnificent castles such as Chambord built. But he was not only a patron, but also a ruler who consistently expanded royal power. Under him, the monarchy was increasingly understood as the embodiment of the state. The famous phrase, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, comes from Louis XIV, but the roots of this idea go back to Francis I. Legally, too, royal authority was strengthened. Francis I concluded the Concordat of Bologna with the Pope in 1516, which gave him control over the appointment of bishops and abbots in France. This meant that the church in the country was largely under royal control, a decisive step towards absolutism. But the Valois dynasty also had to pass one of its most severe tests, the religious wars of the 16th century. With the Reformation, Protestantism also spread in France, especially in the form of Calvinism. The followers, who were called Huguenots, gained numerous followers among the nobility and in the cities. This led to bitter conflicts with the Catholic majorities. From 1562 to 1598, France was shaken by a series of religious wars that plunged the country into chaos. Massacres, sieges, and civil war characterized this era. Probably the most famous event was St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were murdered in Paris and other cities. The monarchy's reputation suffered badly because it seemed incapable of securing peace and order. The last Valois kings, Charles IX and Henry III, were weak rulers who depended on influential families and religious parties. When Henry III was assassinated in 1589, the Valois dynasty ended, but with its end, a new phase began, the rule of the Bourbons, who were to complete absolutism. Despite all the crises, the Valois had laid important foundations. They had centralized administration, brought the church under royal control, promoted culture, and established royalty as the embodiment of the state. The next step was now to be taken by the Bourbons, the establishment of an absolute monarchy in which the king was not only supreme ruler, but almost omnipotent. In the next chapter, we see how the Bourbons, especially Henry IV and Louis XIII, led France out of the turmoil of the religious wars and laid the foundations for the age of the Sun King. Chapter 5. The Bourbons, from Henry IV to Louis XIII. With the death of the last Valois king, Henry III, in 1589, a new dynasty began its rule in France, the Bourbons. They were not only supposed to stabilize the monarchy, but also to develop it into the strongest monarchy in Europe. But in the beginning, there was a king who was not welcome on the French throne at first, Henry IV, the good King Henry. Henry of Navarre, head of the Bourbons, was a direct descendant of the Capetians, but he was a Protestant, and that made him a highly controversial figure in the midst of the bloody religious wars. When he ascended the throne in 1589, a large part of Catholic France refused to recognize him as the rightful ruler. A civil war was imminent, and France was once again on the brink of collapse. Henry IV, however, proved to be a clever and pragmatic ruler. In 1593, he converted to Catholicism, allegedly with the words, "Paris is worth a mass." In doing so, he won the support of the majority of his subjects, without denying his origins as a former Huguenot. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, which granted Protestants far-reaching rights, including the free exercise of religion in certain areas. In doing so, he created a religious peace that brought stability to France for decades. Henry IV also worked to renew the shattered kingdom economically. Together with his capable finance minister Sully, he promoted agriculture, trade, and infrastructure. Roads were built, canals were built, and the reconstruction of the country after the decades of religious wars was pushed forward. He was a king who put the well-being of his subjects first, and therefore became extremely popular among the people. His nickname, Le Bon Roi Henri, testifies to this. But in 1610, Henry IV fell victim to an assassination attempt, a shock for the country, which had only just come to rest. His son, Louis XIII, was only 9 years old, which is why his mother, Maria de' Medici, initially took over the regency. This time was marked by intrigue, power struggles, and uncertainty. The young Louis XIII was only able to take control gradually. However, the decisive figure in his reign was not himself, but his first minister, Cardinal Richelieu. This man shaped France's monarchy like no other. Richelieu understood the state as a unit that stood above everything and saw it as his task to strengthen royal power and weaken all competition. Internally, Richelieu fought against the influence of the Huguenots. Although the Edict of Nantes remained formally in place, it drastically limited their political and military rights. With the Siege of La Rochelle, 1627 to 1628, a stronghold of the Protestants, he demonstrated unmistakably that there could be no independent powers besides the crown. Richelieu also brought the nobility under control. The great princes and dukes who had repeatedly risen up against the king were disempowered or placed under strict supervision. The administration was increasingly supported by civil servants who owed their loyalty to the king alone. In doing so, Richelieu laid the foundation for a centralized state. In foreign policy, Richelieu led France into the 30 Years' War, which devastated Europe from 1618 onwards. Although it may seem paradoxical, he supported the Protestant powers against the Catholic Habsburgs. His goal was not religion, but politics, the weakening of the Habsburg embrace that besieged France from Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Under his leadership, France rose to become a major European power. When Richelieu died in 1642, and Louis XIII followed shortly thereafter, they left behind a France that was centralized, militarily strengthened, and politically united. But the crown now went to Louis XIV, who was only 5 years old, a child who had no idea of the burden of the monarchy. The Bourbons had led France out of the turmoil of the religious wars, and with Henry IV, had created the basis for peace and renewal. With Louis XIII and Richelieu, they had consolidated royal power and elevated France to the status of a European great power. But the real age of the Bourbons was only to begin with Louis XIV, the Sun King, who led the monarchy to its peak. In the next chapter, we will therefore dedicate ourselves to what is probably the most famous of all French kings, Louis XIV and his absolutism in its purest form. Chapter 6. Louis XIV, the Sun King and the culmination of absolutism. When you think of the French monarchy, the first name that comes to mind for many people is Louis XIV, the Sun King. No other ruler embodies absolutism as perfectly as he does. His reign, which lasted from 1643 to 1715, is the longest by a monarch in European history. Under him, the French monarchy achieved an abundance of power that was unparalleled in Europe, and at the same time, his court in Versailles became a symbol of courtly splendor and glory. But the path to becoming the radiant Sun King was not an easy one. When Louis XIV ascended the throne in 1643, he was only 5 years old. The regency was led by his mother, Anna of Austria, supported by Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's successor. This period was marked by riots that became known as Fronde, uprisings of the nobility, parliaments, and sections of the people who protested against the centralizing policies of the crown. These years were formative for the young Ludwig. He personally witnessed how insurgents entered the Louvre and threatened the royal family. From this experience, he drew a lifelong lesson. The king could never allow his power to be shared or weakened. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis XIV took over the reign himself. He declared that he no longer wanted to appoint a first minister, a sign that he wanted to hold the government alone in his hands. The famous motto attributed to him is "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state. Even though he may never have said it literally, it aptly expresses his way of governing. Louis XIV was a master at consolidating his power through symbolism and ritual. He chose the sun as his personal symbol, the center around which everything revolves. The court was designed according to his ideas, especially in Versailles, the magnificent palace that he had expanded from the 1660s onwards. Versailles was more than just a residence, it was a political instrument. The nobility was forced to live at court, where they were kept busy through festivals, ceremonies, and etiquette, thus keeping them away from political influence. Every step the king took, from getting up to going to bed, became a public ritual that staged his power. But Louis XIV was not only a master of self-promotion. His government consistently expanded the state. The administration was led by capable ministers such as Colbert, who reformed the economy, promoted trade, and developed the system of mercantilism. France became the leading trading and industrial nation in Europe. At the same time, Louis created a standing army that was larger and better organized than ever before. In foreign policy, Louis XIV pursued an expansive policy. He saw himself as the natural leader of Europe and strove to expand France's borders. In numerous wars, the War of Devolution, the Dutch Wars, the War of the Palatine Succession, and finally, the War of the Spanish Succession, he tried to expand France's influence. He was able to achieve some successes, but the long wars exhausted the country economically and led to great losses. A particularly controversial step was the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, when Louis XIV wanted to enforce the religious unity of his empire and had Protestantism banned. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots fled abroad, many of them highly educated craftsmen and merchants. In the long term, this weakened the French economy and damaged the king's international reputation. Despite these dark sides, Louis XIV remains the symbol of the absolutist ruler. He knew how to surround the monarchy with an aura of grandeur and inviolability. His court in Versailles was the cultural center of Europe. Artists, musicians, architects, and writers worked on his behalf, and the French style was imitated throughout Europe. When Louis XIV died in 1715, after 72 years of reign, he left behind a powerful but exhausted empire. France was a cultural and political leader, but economically heavily burdened by the wars. His legacy was double-edged. On the one hand, the heyday of absolutism, and on the other, the seeds of the crises that were to lead to the weakening of the monarchy in the 18th century. Nevertheless, Louis XIV remains the formative figure of the French monarchy to this day. His name stands for abundance of power, court splendor, and the self-image of a king who embodied the state in his person. In the next chapter, we see how Chapter 7, Louis XV and Louis XVI, from the flourishing to the decline of the monarchy. After the death of Louis XIV in 1715, his great-grandson Louis XV succeeded him. The Sun King had left behind an empire that was powerful but financially bled dry by long wars. Louis XV was only 5 years old, which is why a regency was initially established under Philip of Orleans. Even in these first years, it became apparent that royalty was entering a new phase after the all-powerful Louis XIV, a phase in which the radiance of absolutism still had an effect, but its authority was increasingly questioned. Louis XV grew up to be an educated but hesitant ruler. He officially ruled from 1723, but his authority was less assertive than that of his great-grandfather. While Louis XIV made the monarchy seem almost superhuman through his personality and his staging, Louis XV was a king of flesh and blood, with strengths but also with weaknesses.
This was reflected in the perception of his subjects. At first, he was popular and was given the nickname the Much Beloved, but in the course of his long reign, this affection turned into disappointment and ridicule. A core problem was the economy. France suffered from the immense burden of debt that Louis XIV had left behind as a result of his wars. Although financial reformers such as Cardinal Fleury tried to stabilize the situation, the structural deficit remained. In addition, there were costly military undertakings. France was involved in almost every European conflict in the 18th century, from the War of the Polish Succession, to the War of the Austrian Succession, to the Seven Years' War. The latter ended in a catastrophic defeat in 1763. France lost almost all of its colonies in North America and India to the British. This loss undermined France's reputation and significantly weakened its position as a world power. The king's authority also began to falter internally. The parliaments, i.e. the highest courts, used their position to block royal decrees. They increasingly saw themselves as defenders of the laws and the liberties of the kingdom, an attitude that limited the monarch's power and undermined absolutism in practice. In addition, Ludwig's private life damaged the reputation of the crown. His affairs, especially those with Madame de Pompadour and later Madame du Barry, were publicly discussed and served as a target for critics who portrayed the king as weak and excessive. The distance between the court and the people grew. While Versailles continued to shine in splendor, the population suffered from poverty and rising taxes. When Louis XV died in 1774, he was severely discredited in public opinion. His successor, Louis XVI, ascended the throne with great expectations. People hoped for a new beginning. The young king was considered good-natured, honest, and dutiful. But he was inexperienced and hesitant, qualities that were to be his undoing in the coming crises. Louis XVI took over an empire that was in urgent need of reforms. The finances were catastrophic. The national budget was crushed by debts and interest. Several finance ministers, including Turgot, Necker, and Cologne, tried to reform the system, but they met with resistance from the nobility, who did not want to give up their tax privileges. Without a fundamental redistribution of the burden, renovation was impossible. A contradiction characterized the reign of Louis XVI. On the one hand, he wanted reforms, but on the other hand, he lacked the determination to push them through in the face of resistance. In addition, his wife, Marie Antoinette, became increasingly a target in public opinion. The Austrian princess was ridiculed as a foreigner and a lavish queen. The infamous rumor that she had given the starving people bread, then they should eat cake, may have been invented, but it symbolized the image of alienated court society. The decisive turning point came with the convocation of the Estates General in 1789. Since the financial crisis seemed insoluble, Louis XVI convened this representative body of the three estates, clergy, nobility, and bourgeoisie, for the first time since 1614. But instead of the hoped-for approval of new taxes, the French Revolution developed here. The Third Estate declared itself a national assembly, demanded a constitution, and questioned the absolute monarchy. Louis XV vacillated between concessions and resistance. Although he accepted the Constitution of 1791, which made him a constitutional monarch, his confidence in the revolution was low. In 1791, he and his family tried to leave the country in the so-called flight to Varennes in order to gain support against the revolution abroad. The escape failed, and trust in the king was finally destroyed. In 1792, the monarchy was officially abolished, and France was declared a republic. Louis XVI was accused of high treason and guillotined in Paris in January 1793. Marie Antoinette followed him a few months later. This ended the more than 1,000-year history of the French monarchy for the time being, a dramatic break that shook the world. The reign of Louis XV and Louis XVI marked the transition from the flowering of absolutism to the collapse of the monarchy. While Louis XV was still living in the splendor of Versailles, but was weakening the empire politically and militarily, Louis XVI was facing a crisis that he was unable to solve. Together, they formed the bridge from the climax to the end, from the splendor of the Ancien Regime to the revolution that opened a new era. In the next chapter, we will look at the dramatic years of the Revolution in which the monarchy was not only overthrown, but also symbolically and realistically decapitated.
Chapter 8: The French Revolution and the End of the Monarchy. The French Revolution was an event that changed not only the history of France, but all of Europe and beyond. It marked the final end of the old order, the Ancien Régime, and with it the overthrow of the monarchy that had shaped France for more than 1,000 years. But this upheaval was neither straightforward nor peaceful. It was full of tensions, contradictions, and dramatic twists and turns. In the beginning, there was the deep crisis of the state. As we have seen, the finances under Louis XVI were catastrophic. In order to introduce new taxes, the king convened the Estates General in 1789, an institution that had not met since 1614. Here, the clergy, nobility, and third estate, i.e., the citizens and ordinary people, were to deliberate. But it soon became apparent that the third estate was no longer willing to accept the old order, in which it was politically disadvantaged despite its numerical superiority. In June 1789, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly and claimed to represent the entire people of France. A little later, the famous Ball House Oath took place, in which the deputies promised not to disperse until France had received a constitution. This laid the foundation. The monarchy could no longer rule absolutely. It had to subordinate itself to the nation. The revolution quickly picked up speed. On July 14, 1789, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille, the symbol of royal despotism. This date is still considered the beginning of the revolution and the national holiday of France. All over the country, people rose up, stormed castles, burned tax registers, demanded freedom and equality. The National Assembly abolished feudal rights and, in the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, declared the basic principles of the new order: liberty, equality, fraternity. The king initially remained in office, but his power was severely limited. France became a constitutional monarchy in which the king existed alongside a parliament. But Louis XVI was not prepared to accept this development. His attempt to flee to Varennes in June 1791 in order to gain support against the revolution abroad completely destroyed his reputation. Many French people now saw him as a traitor to the nation. Political radicalization took its course. Revolutionary clubs, above all the Jacobins, gained influence. Tensions with neighboring states, which saw revolutionary France as a threat, led to war with Austria and Prussia in 1792. In this heated atmosphere, the revolution became more and more radicalized. On August 10, 1792, the people stormed the Tuileries, the king's palace in Paris. Louis XVI was arrested and tried as a simple citizen. In January 1793, he was found guilty of treason and executed by guillotine. A few months later, the same fate befell Marie Antoinette. With these executions, royalty in France was eliminated not only politically but also symbolically. France was now a republic, but the revolution did not proceed in a straight line. The abolition of the monarchy was followed by a period of internal conflicts. The terror under Robespierre, the dictatorship of the Welfare Committee, the struggles between different political camps. The king was dead, but the question of what the new France should look like was far from being decided. Despite all the violence and uncertainty, the fall of the monarchy was a world historical event. For the first time, a people had not only overthrown a king, but had questioned the very idea of monarchy. The French Revolution became a model for many movements around the world and marked the beginning of a new era in which the legitimacy of rule was no longer derived from divine right, but from the people. But the end of the monarchy in France was not final. Attempts were soon to be made to restore them, whether in the form of the empire under Napoleon, the restoration of the Bourbons, or the later constitutional monarchies. But the revolution had irreversibly changed something. Never again could a French king claim that he ruled by God's grace alone. In the next chapter, we will see how, after the chaos of the revolution, a new man came to the top, Napoleon Bonaparte. He led France into a new kind of monarchy, the empire, and showed that the longing for a strong ruler lived on despite all republican ideals. Chapter 9: Napoleon and the Empire, a new form of monarchy. After the fall of the monarchy and the bloody years of the Revolution, France was in uncertainty and political turmoil. Although the Republic had ended the absolute rule of kings, it did not bring lasting stability. Constant changes of government, internal uprisings, and wars against almost all of Europe shook the country. In this climate of chaos and the longing for order, a man who was to leave a lasting mark on the history of France and all of Europe stepped onto the stage. Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was originally a young officer of Corsican origin who rose rapidly during the Revolution. His military talent was already evident in Italy in 1796-97, where he defeated the Austrian troops with ingenious strategy. Soon he was celebrated as a national hero. But Napoleon was more than just a general. He was also a political strategist who knew exactly how to turn his popularity into power. In 1799, he took advantage of the weakness of the Directory, the government of the time, and staged a coup d'etat. The 18th Brumaire marked the beginning of a new era. Napoleon became first consul, de facto sole ruler of France. This meant that the Republic was still formally intact, but power was once again in the hands of a single man. Napoleon saw himself as the consummator of the revolution. He retained many achievements: equality before the law, the abolition of feudal rights, freedom of religion. But he linked it to a strong central authority. The famous Code Civil, also known as the Code Napoleon, created a uniform legal system that is still valid in France today, and also had great influence internationally. In 1804, Napoleon took the next step. He had himself crowned emperor in Paris. In doing so, he introduced a new form of monarchy, not an inherited dynasty by the grace of God, but an empire based on personal glory, popular vote, and revolutionary heritage. The moment when he put the crown on himself instead of accepting it from the Pope became famous. It was a symbol of his independence and his claim. He was ruler by his own efforts, not by tradition. The empire was both a military superpower and a modern administration. Napoleon organized the country efficiently, introduced a modern education system, and strengthened the central power. But above all, he was a general. His wars changed the map of Europe. With victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, he created an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. Many principalities in Germany were reshaped, the Holy Roman Empire fell, and Napoleon's influence reached as far as Italy. But his quest for more and more power eventually led to his decline. The Russian campaign of 1812 turned into a disaster. Of over 600,000 soldiers, only a few tens of thousands returned. In the years that followed, a coalition of almost all European powers formed against him. In 1814, Napoleon had to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. Once again, however, he returned. In 1815, he landed in France, again gathered followers, and ruled during the famous 100 Days. But at Waterloo, he was finally defeated. He was taken to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. With Napoleon, France had experienced a new kind of monarchy. Not a dynastic monarchy as before, but a ruler who rose from the spirit of the revolution, who relied on the people as well as on military glory. He combined republican achievements with monarchical rule and showed that the longing for a strong leader was unbroken even after the revolution. After his fall, France was once again at a crossroads. The old powers of Europe wanted to restore the order of the monarchies and restored the Bourbons to the throne. But society had changed. The Revolution and Napoleon had created values that could no longer be completely suppressed. In the next chapter, we'll see how the Bourbon Restoration went, an attempt to bring back the old monarchy, and at the same time, a constant balancing act between tradition and the new ideas that shaped the 19th century. Chapter 10: The Restoration of the Bourbons, Return and Disintegration. After the fall of Napoleon in 1814, Europe was faced with the task of restoring the old order. The monarchies, which had been shaken by revolution and empire, were to be strengthened again. At the Congress of Vienna, the great powers agreed to return the old Bourbon dynasty to France. Louis XVIII, a brother of the executed Louis XVI, ascended the throne.
This marked the beginning of the so-called Restoration, an era in which attempts were made to revive the pre-revolutionary monarchy. But the return of the Bourbons was anything but easy. France had changed profoundly. The revolution had abolished privileges of the nobility, redistributed property relations, and planted the idea of equality and popular sovereignty in society. Napoleon had consolidated these developments and, at the same time, created a modern administrative and legal system. All this could not simply be turned back. Louis XVIII was realist enough to recognize this. Although he restored the monarchy, he accepted many achievements of the Revolution and the Empire. With the so-called Charte constitutionnelle of 1814, France received a constitution that guaranteed certain fundamental rights and established a parliament. This created a kind of constitutional monarchy in which the king retained great influence but could no longer rule completely absolutely. The years of his reign were marked by a balancing act. On the one side were the ultra-royalists, the old noble families and clergymen who demanded a return to the ancien regime. On the other side were liberals and citizens who wanted to defend the achievements of the revolution. Louis XVIII skillfully maneuvered between these camps, but tensions remained. After his death in 1824, his brother Charles X succeeded him on the throne, a king who was far less willing to compromise. Charles X tried to strengthen the power of the crown and bring the church back into a dominant role. He introduced reparations for nobles who had been expropriated during the Revolution and relied on a reactionary policy that was intended to restore the old conditions as much as possible. However, this policy met with growing resistance. French society had developed in the spirit of revolution and enlightenment. Above all, the aspiring bourgeoisie wanted more political say and rejected the restoration of old privileges. The conflict escalated in 1830, when Charles X dissolved parliament, restricted the freedom of the press, and tried to secure his power by means of emergency decrees. These measures led to a popular uprising in Paris, the so-called July Revolution. Barricade battles shook the capital, and after a few days, Charles X's reign had collapsed. He abdicated and fled into exile. The Restoration had thus failed. The attempt to restore the pre-revolutionary monarchy had only exacerbated tensions in society. But the French did not want to completely renounce a monarchy. Instead, they relied on a new form, a constitutional monarchy that was more closely aligned with the liberal ideas of the bourgeoisie. This is how the July monarchy began with Louis Philippe of Orleans, the citizen king. The restoration of the Bourbons shows how difficult it was to return to the old model after the Revolution and the Empire. Society had changed, and the idea of absolute kingship had lost its legitimacy. The return of the Bourbons seemed like an attempt to turn back time, an attempt that was bound to fail. In the next chapter, we will look at the July monarchy, an epoch that tried to combine monarchy and liberalism, but also broke down due to the tensions between tradition and modernity.
Chapter 11. The July Monarchy, the Citizen King Ludwig Philipp. After the fall of Charles X in the July Revolution of 1830, France was once again at a turning point. The population had firmly rejected the attempt at a reactionary return to the ancien regime. But the majority of French people also did not want to return to the radical republic that had existed in the 1790s. A compromise was sought, a monarchy that could be reconciled with the achievements of the Revolution and the liberal ideas of the time. In this situation, Ludwig Philippe of Orleans, a distant relative of the Bourbons, became the center of the action. Ludwig Philippe was not a traditional king like his predecessors. He came from the House of Orleans, a sideline of the Bourbons, and had initially shown sympathy for liberal ideas during the Revolution. His attitude and reputation as close to the people made him a suitable candidate for a new monarchy that was to be more oriented towards the middle class. On August 9, 1830, he was proclaimed King of the French, a title that was deliberately chosen to emphasize the break with the king's idea by the grace of God. He was no longer to rule over the country, but to rule for the people. The July monarchy represented an attempt to combine monarchy and liberalism. The constitution was revised, censorship was relaxed, and the right to vote was extended, but only to wealthy citizens.
Thus, political power did not lie with the people as a whole, but with the propertied bourgeoisie, which shaped the July monarchy from the very beginning. Ludwig Philipp was therefore given the nickname Citizen King. He maintained a comparatively modest appearance, showed himself in civilian clothes, and sought proximity to the urban bourgeoisie, which benefited from the Industrial Revolution. France did indeed experience a period of economic and industrial development during this period. Railways were built, factories sprang up, and Paris began to transform into a modern metropolis. The bourgeoisie, merchants, entrepreneurs, bankers saw their interests well represented under Ludwig Philipp. But the workers, peasants, and the vast majority of the population remained largely excluded. This social imbalance soon led to tensions. Workers often lived in abject poverty, while a small layer of entrepreneurs became rich. The government often reacted to protests with repression. In 1834, there was a large workers' uprising in Lyon, which was bloodily suppressed. Such events revealed that the July monarchy, although liberal in the sense of the bourgeoisie, offered hardly any social justice. Ludwig Philipp was also cautious in foreign policy. He avoided major wars and sought reconciliation with other European powers. His goal was to maintain stability and permanently secure the monarchy in France. But it was precisely this restraint that was interpreted by many as a weakness. Over time, the popularity of the Citizen King dwindled. Caricatures and mocking pictures showed him as a fat bourgeois who enriched himself on the side of the rich while the people suffered. His proximity to the financial elite made him vulnerable. Scandals about corruption increased the resentment. The decisive moment came in 1848. An economic crisis led to unemployment and hunger. Political reform movements demanded universal suffrage and more say. When Ludwig Philipp finally banned demonstrations, a popular uprising broke out in Paris. Within a few days, the monarchy had collapsed. The king abdicated and fled to England, where he died in exile. With the fall of the July monarchy, the rule of the Bourbons-Orléans ended, and with it the last serious attempt to establish a stable constitutional monarchy in France. The July monarchy was a mirror of its time. It brought progress and modernization, but also social injustice and political exclusion. Their failure showed that the tension between the monarchy and the republican ideal in France was not easy to resolve. In the next chapter, we turn to the Second Republic and the renewed rise of a monarchical figure, Napoleon III, who was first elected president and soon established a new empire.
Chapter 12. The Second Republic and the Second Empire under Napoleon III. With the fall of the July monarchy in February 1848, France once again entered a phase of profound upheaval. The barricades of Paris had chased away the Citizen King, Ludwig Philipp, and the people demanded a new political order. The answer was the proclamation of the Second Republic, a renewed attempt to rule the country without a monarchy. But as before, it was to become clear that France's relationship with the monarchy was complicated. The Second Republic began with high hopes. For the first time, universal male suffrage was introduced, and millions of French people were now able to cast their votes. In the first few months, there was an atmosphere of euphoria. Workers, peasants, intellectuals all believed that a just, democratic society was possible. At the same time, however, deep tensions immediately came to light. While the workers demanded social reforms, better working conditions, minimum wages, state support, the bourgeoisie wanted above all political freedom and protection of property. The conflicts escalated in June 1848 when the national workshops, which provided employment for unemployed men, were closed. There was a bloody workers' uprising in Paris which was brutally suppressed by the army. Thousands of people died, and the gulf between the Republican government and ordinary workers became unbridgeable. In this climate of disappointment, a new figure entered the political arena: Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, a nephew of the great Napoleon I. He ran in the presidential election in December 1848 and won with an overwhelming majority. His name was a symbol that evoked memories of fame, stability, and strength. Many French people hoped that he could unite the country. But Louis Napoleon had more far-reaching plans. Although he was initially president with a limited term in office, when his re-election was ruled out by the Constitution, he resorted to radical means.
On December 2, 1851, the anniversary of Napoleon's coronation as emperor, he staged a coup d'état. He had parliament dissolved, opponents arrested, and proclaimed the Second Empire a year later. He ascended the throne as Napoleon III, and France once again had a monarch. The Second Empire, 1852 to 1870, was a mixture of authoritarian rule and modern reform policies. Napoleon III presented himself as the people's emperor. His power was great, but it was apparently confirmed by the people through regular plebiscites. This form of people's monarchy combined the longing for strong leadership with the legacy of the revolution, in which the people were seen as the source of legitimacy. Domestically, Napoleon III modernized France on a grand scale. Under his rule, the country experienced a phase of economic boom. Railways were expanded, banks were founded, trade and industry were promoted. Under Baron Haussmann, Paris received its present face: wide boulevards, representative buildings, parks and squares. This modernization made France one of the leading industrial nations in Europe. But the empire also had its downsides. Political freedoms were restricted, the press censored, opposition suppressed. It was not until the 1860s that the regime opened up somewhat and allowed limited parliamentary participation. In foreign policy, Napoleon III tried to build on his uncle's fame. In the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, France sided with England against Russia and gained prestige. He also played a role in Italy by supporting the Piedmontese struggle for freedom against Austria. But he also sought adventure in Mexico, where in 1864 he tried to install Archduke Maximilian of Austria, a French-backed emperor, an undertaking that failed miserably in 1867. The greatest disaster, however, was the war against Prussia in 1870, when Napoleon III underestimated the enemy and overestimated his own army. He was captured at the Battle of Sedan, and his empire collapsed in a few days. On September 4, 1870, the Third Republic was proclaimed in Paris. With the end of the Second Empire, the idea of a French monarchy had failed again. Napoleon III had tried to create a new form of monarchy, a mixture of plebiscitary legitimation, authoritarian rule, and modern belief in progress. But his fall showed that the longing for monarchy was repeatedly overtaken by the realities of politics and the forces of republicanism. In the next chapter, we see how France finally becomes a republic after 1870, and how the monarchists tried to gain influence once again, but ultimately failed.
Chapter 13: The Third Republic and the Final Failure of the Monarchists. With the defeat of France in the war against Prussia in 1870 and the capture of Napoleon III in Sedan, the Second Empire ended abruptly. Paris rose again, and on September 4, 1870, the Third Republic was proclaimed. But although the Republic was now a reality, this did not mean that the monarchy had disappeared from France for good. In the first years after the fall of Napoleon III, it even seemed likely that the monarchy could return once again. First, however, France had to face the immediate consequences of the defeat. The Franco-German War had deeply shaken the country. In the Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871, France had to cede Alsace-Lorraine to the newly founded German Empire, a humiliating defeat that left deep traces in the national consciousness. At the same time, the uprising of the Paris Commune in the spring of 1871 shook the country. The Commune was a radical democratic experiment that dominated Paris for several weeks until it was bloodily suppressed by government troops. These traumatic events increased political uncertainty. In this situation, a return to the monarchy seemed to be the best solution for many. In fact, the monarchists had a majority in the newly elected National Assembly. However, they were divided into two camps: the Legitimists, who preferred the oldest branch of the Bourbons, and the Orleanists, who supported the closer to the people branch around Louis Philippe of Orleans. If a candidate is agreed, it is hoped that France could get a king again. The plan was to place Henri d'Artois, Count of Chambord, on the throne. He was the last male descendant of the older Bourbon line and was to reign as Henry V. But he made one condition: the return to the monarchy must also be a return to the old symbols, including the white Bourbon flag.
This was unacceptable to many French people who had become accustomed to the tricolor as a symbol of the revolution and the nation. The Count of Chambord steadfastly refused to compromise. This meant that the chance for a monarchical restoration was lost. The Orleanists, on the other hand, relied on the grandson of Louis Philippe, the Count of Paris. But as long as Henri von Chambord lived, they did not want to risk an open rupture. So the monarchist camp remained divided, and the opportunity evaporated. Meanwhile, the Third Republic slowly stabilized. It was initially intended as a transitional regime, but it gradually developed fixed structures. With the constitutions of 1875, France received a republican system with president, parliament, and a clear separation of powers. Until the 1880s, the monarchists still hoped that the republic could fail, but time worked against them. A symbolic moment was the death of the Count of Chambord in 1883. With him, the older Bourbon line became extinct. The Legitimists now had no alternative but to follow the Orleanists, but in the meantime, the Republic had consolidated itself to such an extent that a restoration was hardly conceivable. At the same time, the Republic developed into an ideological countermodel to the monarchy. It relied on secularization, on the Republican school system, on the spread of Republican values. Monuments to the Republic were erected in towns and villages, and the tricolor finally became a national symbol. Monarchism remained present in political life, but it lost more and more influence. The younger generations in particular, who were educated in Republican schools, felt that the monarchy was outdated. While monarchists lost themselves in traditions and nostalgic memories of the Ancien Regime, the Republic offered progress, national unity, and a broad base. The failure of the monarchists in the Third Republic marked the final break. For the last time in the history of France, there was a realistic chance of restoring the monarchy. But internal divisions, a lack of willingness to compromise, and the dynamism of Republican institutions destroyed this possibility. From then on, the monarchy in France was only a memory, a chapter of history, no longer of the present. In the next chapter, we will examine how the Republic not only replaced the monarchy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but deliberately designed it as an alternative, and how the idea of royalty gradually lost its place in political thought.
Chapter 14: Republic versus Monarchy, the ideological struggle in the 19th century. Although the Third Republic was consolidated in the 1870s, the contrast between monarchy and republic was far from overcome. The monarchists had missed their last great chance, but they remained a political and cultural force that tried to influence society. In the second half of the 19th century, France was a country characterized by contrasts: city and country, tradition and modernity, church and secularism, monarchy and republic. The monarchist idea lived on, especially in conservative circles. Noble families, parts of the clergy, and rural regions held on to the ideal of royalty. For them, the republic was an unnatural state of affairs, a result of the revolution that would have to be corrected sooner or later. Many saw the king as the guarantor of order, religion, and national unity. On the other hand, there was the Republican movement, which no longer saw itself only as a political option, but as an ideology. For its supporters, the Republic was not just a form of government, but a value in itself. It embodied freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty, the principles that had their origins in the Revolution of 1789. The ideological struggle was particularly visible in the education system. Republicans realized that school was the key to shaping the thinking of generations to come. The school laws of the 1880s introduced a secular, free, and compulsory school system. Religious influences were to be pushed back, Republican values were to be strengthened. Children no longer learned loyalty to the king, but love for the nation and the ideals of the Republic. The Republic also prevailed against the monarchy in the public sphere. Squares, streets, and monuments were dedicated to Republican heroes. The tricolor became the ubiquitous flag, and Marianne, the female allegory of the Republic, appeared in town halls, schools, and on coins. The symbols of the monarchy lost their visibility, while the Republican identity became more and more anchored in everyday life. But monarchism did not disappear completely.
He adopted and found new forms of expression. Some monarchist currents allied themselves with Catholicism and advocated a Catholic restoration. Others, such as the movement around Charles Maurras and the Action Française at the end of the 19th century, gave monarchism a nationalist and authoritarian character. For them, the republic was weak and divided, while only a king could unite and strengthen the country. Despite these efforts, monarchism remained a minority movement. The majority of the French came to terms with the Republic, even if it repeatedly got into crises. The Third Republic in particular showed that it was resilient. It survived scandals, economic crises, and political intrigues, all of which might have favored a monarchical restoration in earlier times. But this time, the Republic remained. Republican ideology won above all by claiming the language of the nation for itself. While monarchists clung to old dynasties, the Republic declared that it embodied the people themselves. It presented itself as the guardian of national interests, a defender against external enemies, and a guarantor of internal freedom. In doing so, it deprived the monarchy of its strongest argument, its role as a symbol of unity. At the end of the 19th century, the Republic was no longer just a political emergency solution, but the firmly anchored form of government in France. The struggle between monarchy and republic was not completely over, but it had reached a new quality. The monarchy had become an idea that lived only in marginal areas and nostalgic circles, while the republic asserted itself as the political reality. In the next chapter, we will look at how the monarchy was finally relegated to the realm of memory in the 20th century, and how it nevertheless retained a certain significance as a cultural heritage and symbol.
Chapter 15. The Monarchy in the 20th Century. Memory instead of reality. When the 20th century began, France was firmly in Republican hands. The Third Republic had prevailed and had become a stable order, even if it continued to be marked by political crises and internal tensions. The monarchy, on the other hand, had long since ceased to be a real power, but only a memory, a historical legacy that lived on as a nostalgic dream for some, but was seen as a symbol of backwardness for others. The monarchist movements continued to exist, but their chances of an actual return to power were dwindling. After the death of the Count of Chambord in 1883, the last direct Bourbon of the older line, the Orleanists had taken over the dynastic leadership. The Count of Paris was considered the rightful king in monarchist circles, but his role was purely symbolic. He was hardly able to exert any political influence, as the Republic was no longer in question. At the beginning of the 20th century, however, a movement emerged that tried to give new impetus to monarchism, the Action Française under Charles Maurras. This nationalist authoritarian movement saw the Republic as weak and fragmented, and propagated a return to the monarchy as a means of restoring France's strength. Maurras combined monarchism with nationalism and anti-parliamentarianism. He was heard above all in the right-wing political spectrum. But despite its rhetorical power, this movement ultimately remained influential in the discourse, but powerless in practice. France, meanwhile, was entering a new era. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, put the Republic to the test, but it strengthened it in the end. The Republican regime was able to show that it was able to lead the nation in an unprecedented war. Millions of soldiers fought and died under the tricolor, not for a king, but for the Republic. This meant that monarchism lost even more ground. It had nothing to oppose to the national sacrifice, which would have bound people more emotionally than the Republican symbols. Even in the Second World War, the monarchy no longer played a role. The Vichy regime under Marshal Pétain tried to propagate conservative values and a return to order and tradition. But it was not a monarchy, but an authoritarian dictatorship. Monarchist ideas did find favor in some reactionary circles, but they had no influence on political reality. After 1945, monarchism was finally pushed to the margins. France had a new constitution, the Fourth Republic, and later the Fifth Republic under Charles de Gaulle, which still exists today. This republic was strongly influenced by the idea of a central authority, embodied by the president, who, in a certain way, played a role similar to that of the king. As a symbol of the nation,
as a guarantor of unity, as the supreme representative at home and abroad. But it was no longer a monarchy, but a democratically legitimized presidential power. Nevertheless, the monarchy did not completely disappear from cultural memory. It remained alive in architecture, in the architecture of Versailles, Chambord, or Fontainebleau, in literature, in paintings, and in the memory of a glorious past. Tourists flocked to the royal palaces, writers took up the image of kings and queens, and the Revolution of 1789 became inextricably linked to the idea that France had once been a powerful monarchy that was overthrown. Dynastic descendants of the Bourbons and Orleanists also exist to this day, but they no longer play a role in French political life. From time to time, monarchist groups speak out, calling for a symbolic return to the crown, or stylizing themselves as true preservers of French tradition. But the vast majority of French people now see the monarchy only as part of history, a chapter that has been closed. In the 20th century, the monarchy finally became a memory. It was no longer a political project, but a cultural heritage. France had come to terms with its republican identity and anchored it so strongly in education, politics, and everyday life that a return to the monarchy became unimaginable. In the next chapter, we will examine how this culture of remembrance evolved, how the monarchy remained present in the collective memory, not as a political alternative, but as part of French identity and as a fascinating legacy that continues to resonate today in art, architecture, and popular culture. Chapter 16: The Monarchy in Collective Memory, Glamour, Nostalgia, and Criticism. Even though France has not had a monarchy for over a century, the image of kings and queens is still alive in the country's collective memory. The French monarchy has become not only a political chapter of the past, but a part of the national identity, a legacy that is viewed with pride, nostalgia, and criticism at the same time. The monarchy is particularly present through its monuments. Castles such as Versailles, Chambord, Fontainebleau, or Reims Cathedral, where kings were crowned over centuries, are still visible symbols of a glorious past. Millions of visitors flock to Versailles every year to see the halls where Louis XIV staged his court. These places are not only tourist attractions, but also memory spaces where France stages and tells its history. The memory of the monarchy is shaped by two major currents. On the one hand, there is nostalgia. The splendor of the Sun King, the elegance of Marie Antoinette, the chivalry of the medieval kings, all of this fascinates many people to this day. Films, series, and books pick up on these images, from historical films to novels to modern series productions. They paint a picture of a time full of splendor, courtly etiquette, and dramatic fetes. On the other hand, there is critical memory. The monarchy is also seen as a symbol of injustice and oppression, a system based on privilege that exploited the common people. In this context, the French Revolution is more than a historical event. It is a moral break with an order that had to be overcome. In Republican schools, this view was emphasized for a long time. The kings were tyrants, the revolutionaries were freedom heroes. This double memory, fascination and rejection at the same time, shapes France's way of dealing with its monarchical past. While Versailles shines in all its glory, the guillotine and the storming of the Bastille are remembered at the same time. In the collective consciousness, the monarchy is less a concrete political option than a symbol that can stand for very different things, for greatness and splendor, as well as for injustice and oppression. It is interesting that the monarchy has not completely disappeared from the political culture of France. Although hardly anyone is seriously calling for their return today, the role of the president in the Fifth Republic bears the traits of a modern republican monarchy. The president is not only head of government, but also a symbol of the nation, the bearer of an almost sacred authority that is reminiscent of the old royal dignity. Some historians therefore speak of the monarchical president of France. In addition, the monarchy lives on in cultural traditions. Festivals, rituals, symbols, many things have their origins in the royal past. France's international fame is also closely linked to its kings. When people talk about French culture, it is often the times of Louis XIV, Baroque architecture, courtly music, or 18th century fashion that serve as references. At the same time, the monarchy remains a subject of debate. Historians debate whether it united or divided France, whether it modernized or inhibited the country. Socially, it is sometimes romanticized, sometimes criticized, but rarely ignored. In school textbooks, museums, and commemorative days, the monarchy is omnipresent, even if it is long gone. This shows that the monarchy has ceased to be a political reality in France, but it has not ceased to be important. It is part of a collective identity that moves in the field of tension between pride and criticism. They are remembered, they are argued about, they are staged in art and culture, but they don't want to go back. In the next chapter, we will look at how France's presidents of the Fifth Republic became, in a sense, the successors of kings, as republican monarchs who play an almost royal role in a modern democracy.
Chapter 17: The President as Republican Monarch, Continuities and Breaks. If you look at today's France, you might think at first glance that the monarchy has long been history. The Republic has ruled for over 150 years, and kings or emperors no longer play a role. But a closer look shows that French politics still bears traits reminiscent of the old monarchy. Especially in the Fifth Republic, which was founded in 1958 under Charles de Gaulle, the president takes on a role that many observers call the Republican monarchy. This expression points to a remarkable continuity. Although France has abolished the monarchy, its spirit lives on in some ways in presidential power. The president is not only the head of government or the highest representative of the executive, but also a symbolic figure who embodies the unity of the nation, much like the king used to be. Charles de Gaulle, the founder of the Fifth Republic, was aware of this symbolism. In a time of political instability, the Fourth Republic was paralyzed by weak governments and changing majorities. He created a constitution that gave the president extraordinary power. He became the central actor, directly elected by the people, equipped with competences in foreign policy, defense, and even emergency powers in the event of a crisis. De Gaulle staged himself like a modern monarch. His speeches were permeated with pathos. He spoke of the rank of France, of greatness and fate. He appeared less as a party politician than as the embodiment of the nation. In a way, he continued a tradition that stretches from sacred royalty to Napoleon to the presidents of the Republic, the idea that France needed a strong, almost exaggerated leader. Presidents such as François Mitterrand, Jacques Chirac, and Emmanuel Macron saw themselves not only as political leaders, but also as representatives of a historic mission. Macron, for example, spoke early in his term of office that the presidency had a Jupiterian dimension, an echo of the majestic, almost divine role of the king. The parallels are also visible in the architecture and ceremonial of the Republic. The president resides in the Élysée Palace, receives ambassadors, gives New Year's speeches, and appears at state ceremonies with a dignity reminiscent of royal ceremonies. Even July 14th, the national holiday commemorating the revolution against the monarchy, is now a day on which the president, as commander-in-chief of the army, takes part in a military parade, a role that used to be reserved for the king. But despite these monarchical traits, there are significant differences. The president is democratically elected, his term of office is limited, and he can be voted out of office. While the monarchy was based on dynastic legitimacy and divine consecration, the authority of the president is based on the consent of the people. The Republican monarchy is therefore not a return to the old order, but a modern transformation that combines elements of monarchical symbolism with the principles of democracy. At the same time, there is also an ambivalence here. The strong role of the president often makes the French political system very dependent on a single person. If the president is popular and charismatic, the model works well. However, if it is weak or controversial, the entire political order is in crisis. Some critics therefore speak of a hypertrophy of the presidency, a superior power that poses dangers to the democratic balance. Nevertheless, for many French people, the figure of the president remains a kind of legacy of the monarchy. He embodies not only the institution, but also the nation itself.
In a country that is proud of its history and where kings and emperors have been the center of the state for so long, this continuity seems almost inevitable. So it can be said that France has abolished the monarchy, but not the idea of the one strong leader who stands above the parties and embodies the country. In this sense, the president of the Fifth Republic is a modern king, a republican monarch whose power is bestowed not by God, but by the people. In the next chapter, we will look at how the monarchy lives on in art, literature, and popular culture, and how it continues to serve as a projection screen for dreams, criticism, and nostalgia to this day.
Chapter 18: The Monarchy in Art, Literature, and Popular Culture. Although the monarchy has not been a political reality in France for over 150 years, it lives on unabated in art, literature, and popular culture. Their kings and queens, their palaces, and their rituals have become a cultural heritage that continues to have an impact today, sometimes glorified and nostalgic, sometimes critical and ironic. The monarchy has taken up literature in particular again and again. As early as the 19th century, writers such as Victor Hugo created monumental works in which the kings of France appeared, not as idealized rulers, but as people full of contradictions. In Notre Dame de Paris, for example, Louis XI appears as a gloomy figure, while the cathedral itself functions as a symbol of a time when royal power and religion were inextricably linked. Alexander Dumas also immortalized the monarchy. With The Three Musketeers or The Count of Monte Cristo, he created adventure stories that repeatedly delve into the era of the Bourbons and immortalize kings such as Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu in literature. The memory of the monarchy has also left deep traces in the visual arts. Painters of the 19th century such as Eugène Delacroix and Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres dealt with royal themes, sometimes in a heroic way, sometimes in a nostalgic way. The depiction of Joan of Arc supporting the rightful king in the Hundred Years' War became a symbol of national identity that monarchists and republicans alike could claim. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the monarchy has increasingly shifted into the sphere of popular culture. Films and series take up the stories of the French kings again and again. Marie Antoinette is one of the most dazzling figures. She has been portrayed several times by Hollywood as a tragic queen, as a style-conscious icon, as a symbol of abundance and alienation from the people. Sofia Coppola's film Marie Antoinette, 2006, for example, deliberately portrayed her as a pop figure, embedded in a colorful, almost modern aesthetic. Versailles itself also became the scene of cultural productions. Series such as Versailles stage life at the court of Louis XIV with all its splendor, intrigues, and scandals. There is a double movement. On the one hand, the kings are romanticized as charismatic figures full of power and passion. On the other hand, the dark sides, intrigues, abuse of power, social inequality, are emphasized, which only increase the fascination. Fashion and music have also taken up the monarchy. The Rococo style, with its playful shapes and bright colors, is still a source of inspiration for designers today. Musicians such as Madonna or Lady Gaga repeatedly resorted to royal symbols in their shows to represent power, glamour, and excess. In a way, this makes the French monarchy a global pop icon, a cultural treasure that can be translated into new contexts. The monarchy also lives on in political satire. To this day, cartoonists like to use images of kings to criticize political leaders. If a president appears too authoritarian, he is portrayed as the new Sun King. When politicians enjoy luxury, they appear as modern Marie Antoinettes. These comparisons show how deeply the monarchy is anchored in cultural memory. It provides images and metaphors that can be used to describe current politics. At the same time, the monarchy also remains a tourist figurehead. Castles, gardens, art collections, they are not only historical monuments, but also part of the French identity, which is marketed internationally. Versailles is representative of an era in which France set the tone culturally and politically. This shows that the monarchy has not disappeared in France, but has changed its shape. It lives on as cultural memory, as material for literature and film, as a symbol in fashion and music, as a metaphor in politics and satire. It is no longer an institution, but a cultural reservoir from which France still draws today.
In the next chapter, we will look at how historians, intellectuals, and society at large perceive the monarchy in the 21st century, between scientific analysis, tourist fascination, and a certain nostalgic longing.
Chapter 19: The Monarchy in the 21st Century, Culture of Remembrance and Public Debates. Today, more than 2 centuries after the French Revolution, the monarchy in France has long since ceased to be a political reality, and yet it remains alive in the public consciousness. In the 21st century, it takes the form of a culture of remembrance, a collective memory that is cultivated by museums, schools, the media, and tourism alike. At the same time, the monarchy is repeatedly the subject of debates that are less about a concrete return than about its symbolic significance and its place in French identity. An important aspect is the role of castles and monuments. Versailles is the outstanding example. Not only is it a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but it's also an international magnet that attracts millions of visitors from all over the world. Versailles embodies the splendor of the monarchy, but also its dark sides, pomp and elegance, but also waste and social distance. Guided tours and exhibitions therefore often reveal both sides. The same applies to other sites such as Chambord or Fontainebleau, which are part of a tourist staging in which the monarchy becomes a narrative, a chapter of history that can be experienced in magnificent rooms. The monarchy also continues to play a major role in historiography. Historians are working on presenting royalty in a more differentiated way. For a long time, the monarchy was considered almost exclusively a symbol of tyranny and injustice in the Republican tradition. Today, it is often viewed in a more nuanced way, as an institution that shaped, modernized, and united France, even if it was associated with oppression and privilege. Recent research emphasizes the complexity. Kings were not only oppressors, but also actors who initiated reforms, promoted culture, and developed the state. In the public debate, the monarchy usually appears in the form of comparisons. When presidents are described as monarchical, it is less about a concrete return to the crown than about a criticism of the power of the president's office. Emmanuel Macron, for example, has been referred to several times as the Jupiter president, an expression that deliberately reminds us of the omnipotence of kings. These comparisons show that the monarchy continues to serve as a reference point in France to describe and classify political power. Interestingly, there are still monarchist movements in France today. Small groups such as the descendants of the Bourbons or the Orleans line theoretically claim the throne. They appear at official events, give interviews, and cultivate the dynastic legacy. But their role is purely symbolic. They find hardly any supporters among the population, and a serious debate about the reintroduction of the monarchy does not exist. Nevertheless, these figures exert a certain fascination. They remind us that the monarchy is dead, but still alive as an idea. In the popular culture of the 21st century, the monarchy also continues to be evident. Series, films, and novels have taken up the topic, and social media has revived interest in historical figures such as Marie Antoinette or Louis XIV. These figures have become icons that are viewed sometimes critically, sometimes nostalgically, sometimes ironically. For many young people, the monarchy is not primarily a political system, but an aesthetic experience. Magnificent dresses, courtly celebrations, dramatic fetes. In schools, on the other hand, the monarchy is taught primarily in the context of the Revolution of 1789. It appears as a necessary predecessor, as a system that had to be overthrown in order to achieve freedom and equality. At the same time, efforts are made not to neglect the complexity. Students should recognize that the monarchy also laid the foundations for the modern nation. This makes it clear that in the 21st century, the monarchy in France is no longer a political alternative, but a cultural and historical heritage. It lives on in memories, debates, films, museums, and comparisons. For some, it is a symbol of splendor and beauty. For others, of oppression and injustice. For most, however, it is simply a part of history that does not return, but continues to have an impact today. In the next chapter, we will take a look at the overall development and draw a conclusion. What does the French monarchy mean in the long term?
What remains of it in the identity of France, and why does it still exert such a fascination today?
Chapter 20. Conclusion. The French monarchy between history, heritage, and myth. The history of the French monarchy spans more than a millennium, from the first Merovingian kings in the 5th century to the fall of Louis XVI in the Revolution, and the later, brief rebirths under the Bourbons, Orleans, and Bonaparte. During this long time, the monarchy developed from a tribal royal rule to a sacral medieval royalty to radiant absolutism, and finally to a dramatic downfall in the Revolution. So what remains of this long history? First of all, the realization that the monarchy of France was not static, but changed again and again. It adapted to new times, absorbed new ideas, absorbed elements of the church, nobility, bourgeoisie, and people, and transformed itself from the anointed ruler by the grace of God to the citizen king, or people's emperor. It is precisely this ability to change that explains why the monarchy survived for so long. At the same time, it becomes clear that the monarchy has always been caught between tradition and reform. The Capetians built their rule on sacral legitimacy, but they also created administrative structures that modernized the empire. The Valois embodied Renaissance and court culture, while at the same time drowning in the blood of the wars of religion. The Bourbons made the crown the epitome of absolute power with Louis XIV, but his successors lost this power to the pressure of society and the Revolution. Finally, Napoleon created an empire that fused republican principles and monarchical rule, a final proof of how flexible the idea of royalty could be in France. But the Revolution of 1789 marked a break that could no longer be mended. It destroyed not only the institution, but also the legitimacy of the monarchy. From then on, every return, whether Bourbon, Orleans, or Napoleon III, was only an episode. Society had changed. Freedom, equality, and popular sovereignty had become values that could no longer be reconciled with dynastic rule. And yet, the monarchy never completely disappeared. It remained as a memory, as a legacy, as cultural capital. Versailles, the cathedrals, the big names, Louis XIV, Marie Antoinette, Napoleon, they are all inseparable from the French identity. France is proud of its revolution, but it is equally proud of the cultural heritage of its monarchy. In the 21st century, the monarchy no longer lives as a political institution, but as a myth. It is a mirror in which the French and the world look at each other equally, a symbol of splendor and oppression, of greatness and failure, of history and modernity. It is part of films, novels, tourism, and political language. When the president is described as monarchical, when Marie Antoinette is staged as a fashion icon, or Louis XIV is quoted as a symbol of France's greatness, then it becomes clear how deeply royalty remains anchored in the collective consciousness. Thus, the history of the French monarchy does not end with its political death, but passes into a different form. It lives on as a narrative, as a cultural heritage, as a myth that is constantly being reinterpreted. France no longer has kings, but it has a monarchical past that has shaped it like hardly any other country. The monarchy was France's first major political form, and it left traces that are still recognizable even in the Republic. The authority of the president, the symbolism of the state, the love of great figures, all these are echoes of a time when the king embodied the empire. In the end, one can say that the French monarchy is history, but it is also the present, as a legacy, as a memory, as a myth. It is part of what makes France what it is today.